Alrighty. Well, I'll be giving a brief abstract to summarize the thesis for the audience. So essentially, my paper was on normative justice in economics and whether one can first off apply a principle of justice to our resources and the material base that our social community is founded upon. And after concluding that, yes, we can do that, I then raised the question, how do we best assure justice? Is it through economic redistribution and socialization, or is justice better assured by letting the free market run its course? And through the course of my paper, I end up deciding that it is in fact the latter, and that we should let the market end up allocating resources, because while minor injustices occur, it still preserves a more just society in the long run. And the reason for this is economic socialization, A, creates a false conception of justice, or is based upon a false conception of justice. When we come to issues like redistribution, we find that it requires us to treat people differently under the law, based on different criteria than their humanness, and the ultimate result is an arbitrary rule of law that treats people unequally, and that because material equality is incompatible with legal equality. And so as a result, we see that there is, first and foremost, economic socialization concerns itself with a false form of justice. But secondly, even if we accept the redistributors' argument and agree that material outcomes are of the utmost significance, if we take into account multi-generational issues, we see that over the long run, economic socialization results in practices that are not sustainable and foist a burden upon future generations, thereby resulting once again in unequal outcomes. And lastly, we conclude by taking a look at the issue of income mobility and seeing how people move upward through income brackets, and therefore even in a free market, even though the starting lines are all a little bit different, the end places have a far smaller disparity than what is widely reported by misrepresented data. So that is why I end up concluding with the thesis that I do. And I guess I'm taking questions now.
Thank you, Master Truitt. My first question, I'll softball it for you. Given the recent banking crisis that this country experienced, the housing crisis that we experienced in the early 2000s, how do you reconcile your thesis with the natural disposition of large financial industries to look out for their profits first rather than the interests of the common man?
When it comes to the issue of banking specifically, I think we need a level of governmental control that is something a little bit different than what I'm concerned with regards to my thesis specifically. When it comes to banking, the problem, I think, is the entirety of the banking system as a whole. Based on its practice of fractional reserve banking and essentially creating money out of nothing, artificially inflating the money supply, undermining individual purchasing power in the process, and creating monetary fluctuations that are difficult to track and as a result difficult to rectify, the banking industry creates a large amount of problems. But these problems don't really, I don't think, deal necessarily with the issue of economic socialization, because the bank operating by itself is not necessarily doing anything that redistributes wealth except for in the bank's favor. And so when the government steps in to regulate bank reserves or in some other manner control the banks, they're not stepping in necessarily to redistribute wealth, but rather to ensure that banks are not undermining individual purchasing power through illegitimate practices.
Hi. Sorry, Master Truitt. I guess I'm just supposed to start with saying something nice or positive. So sorry to question, and then I just wanted to say that I thought your paper was exceptionally well written and planned. I loved the support that you provided throughout, from your historical sources to just your logic that was implied through your writing. And I really love how you were able to communicate. I'm not a huge fan of economics, but I did enjoy your paper, and I really enjoyed how you spoke to everyone. So if you have a chance, you should read it. But good job.
Thank you.
Very nice. I guess my first question would be, why did you choose the subject? Obviously, we know that you love it and you wanted to spend 100 hours on it, but why normative justice in economics?
Because I think the issue is one that's incredibly important, for one, because we have so many redistributive policies put in place by the government right now, and as we've seen, those are unsustainable policies that are ultimately inflicting economic damage on future generations while simultaneously undermining our legal system and replacing the equality of humanity with equality based on different subjective criteria that are not one's humanness. So with that in our public policy field, and with that being such a prominent idea when it comes to government and the politics of the United States, I thought it was very important to address.
Okay, something nice. This is a little out of character for me, but I think when you're making an argument, one of the strongest ways to do it is to frame the opponent's argument as well as it can be framed, even better than they did themselves. Dostoevsky was a master of this. I think you did a really good job of that. I think you did a really good job framing the opposition's argument before you knocked it down. So that's good. The first question I would have for you, though, you have argued that things like progressive tax rates, for example, treat different people differently under the law.
Mm-hmm.
I think the obvious retort is no. Everybody who makes over $1 million gets taxed at the same confiscatory tax rate.
Right.
It's a little bit like speed limits. Okay, they apply to everybody, but not everybody gets a ticket. How would you respond?
Well, I think, you do raise an excellent point. And there's something about the progressive income tax that is less insidious than other types of policies that are subject to a more wide of a change. Because we do have a somewhat objective rule of law, we can predict exactly what that tax bracket will be, and as such, individuals can make decisions in accordance with that. So you do raise a legitimate point. I think the problem arises with the fact that, A, the progressive income tax is still subject to change. For example, in World War II, we saw that income tax rise up above 90% levels on top income brackets. And so when the government can change it as a result, there's still an inherent instability in the market, a lack of predictability, and a lack of an objective rule of law, which ultimately results in a lack of a capacity for the individual to make the proper economic decisions. But then concerning ourselves specifically with the issue of justice, I would still argue that it treats people differently based on subjective criteria outside of their worth as human beings. Because we take a look at the issue of an individual who has more wealth than another individual. The rule of law is orchestrated to benefit the one with less wealth. And by orchestrating our law in such a manner, we end up propagating a system that treats those with less wealth differentially, preferentially. And okay.
Can I ask a quick clarification? Because
Mm-hmm.
you're using the word wealth. And we don't have a wealth tax. We have an income tax. So we're not being taxed on our status. We're being taxed on an activity.
Sure. So those who have a broader means of acquiring wealth, those who acquire more wealth in the course of a year in the fiscal year that they are taxed in. So those with a larger income end up being treated, or those with a smaller income, end up being treated preferentially. And so by establishing a rule of law that does that, we end up treating people based on criteria that is separate from their humanness. The thesis behind that type of law cannot be that all men are created equal. Rather, it is that all men are created equal with respect to however much money they should earn. So we've taken a subjective criteria and applied it to individual human worth. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for your response. I'll catch you next time around.
Alrighty.
I did want to say that I agreed with your thesis before I read it. But you taught me a lot of interesting new ways to think of it, and I do appreciate all the details and things you had in there. And when I think about your third paragraph, you mentioned the mass of literature, if you will, against capitalism and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And you do go on to sort of explain some of that, I think maybe in gentle terms, And I'm just wondering, in your research, if you found any other theories about what the cause of that mass of literature is that's against capitalism? Is there, anti-Americanism? Are there conspiracy theories out there? What did you find anything else going on behind that?
I think the best answer to your question comes in a book by a man named Joseph A. Schumpeter, who wrote a book titled Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which I've not read, but I can give you the spark notes for it that I have read, where basically his thesis is that because of capitalism's inevitable trend toward corporatism, where the government becomes involved to protect special interests in the forms of those corporations and businesses that have a lot of the wealth, people will start to look at corporatism, associate that with capitalism, and then argue against capitalism as a system. And that kind of goes back to the first question, where we were discussing the issue of governmental involvement with banks. What happens with banks is that the governments treat them preferentially. And again, it's an issue of the government becoming involved in the economy not to assure economic justice, but instead they become involved to assure the special interests of corporations. But because capitalism allows for the success of the individual and allows for individuals to form and develop corporations and become incredibly wealthy and prosperous as a result, it is easy to confuse that issue of corporatism and capitalism. And as a result, society, in a rejection of corporatism, trends more and more to the antithesis, which is socialism, but ultimately results in just as much of a governmental intervention in the economy.
Hi, Master Chert. Sorry for breaking protocol earlier. I think I
You're fine.
was really excited to ask a question. I need to acknowledge the work you did first. I thought your paper was very well written. It was organized expertly. I'm a fan of your writing. And I think if you keep up this organization, you'll produce better works than you've produced today.
Thank you.
My second question is about Section 3, redistribution of income. I think that was the name of the section. I apologize for not getting it right. I don't have a page number here because there aren't page numbers. That's fine. You mentioned that historical revolutions are clearly not predicated on income inequality. I never thought that was the case. I thought it was interesting you mentioned income inequality as part of historical revolutions. I was thinking about bringing that up as I was reading the paper. I'm glad you did bring it up. I don't think historical revolutions we've seen, be they in monarchs or serfdoms, had anything to do with income inequality. I thought it had much more to do with wealth/power inequality. How do you explain that the current economic trend we're seeing here with the growing gap in income inequality is not also reflective of these historical revolutions of wealth inequality, where it's not so much the common folk were upset about income inequality rather than it was a disproportionate amount of power in the hands of a particular select few people?
Could you phrase your question in like a one sentence?
Absolutely, that was a really long sentence.
Yeah.
I feel like you're conflating income inequality and wealth inequality. My question
Okay.
is about historical revolutions. It wasn't so much about income inequality as power disparities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I see the state of affairs today. How does what I've just said about power inequality, wealth inequality, align with your thesis? If I had to just plug out the words income inequality and put wealth or power inequality, how does that affect your thesis?
So I think that, the historical data that deals with the amount of wealth that individuals received, that I quoted coming from the paper regarding the Russian Revolution and then the French Revolution and the American Revolution. All of that, I think, does deal to a large extent with wealth inequality, because measurements of income at that time were much more difficult to calculate than just a measure of an individual's wealth. So I think we could replace the word income with wealth in those studies without too much of a conflation or confusion of the data. At the same time, I would completely agree with you that the majority of these resolutions are predicated on a power inequality. I think that it is not the power inequality that stems from the wealth inequality, however, but instead it is the wealth inequality which stems from the inequality of the power system. And so what you have is a country like Tsarist Russia, which orchestrates its economy in such a way as to benefit the landholders and the feudal lords. And as a result, those serfs who have to live under them can't acquire large amounts of wealth. It's impossible for them to do that under the economic system. And so then that wealth disparity ends up emerging as a symptom of that power disparity. But that power disparity, I think, is once again caused by that same sort of redistributive practice that we have tried to institute in the United States of America today. We've taken a look at the symptom of seeing issues of wealth inequality, and we've said, that's a bad thing, we have to fix that. But in stepping in to fix wealth inequality, we've changed our system, which is one that I don't think has ever been feudal, has always been predicated on freedom, to one that is now devoted toward assisting the poor. And again, there's nothing wrong with assisting the poor, but when it comes to governmental redistribution, we end up, once again, placing a different value on human life than their humanity themselves, and creating a subjective rule of law that becomes more and more subject to change and more tyrannical, potentially, over time.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so obviously 100 hours is a lot of time to put into this paper, and you obviously know a lot about it. What's something that stands out to you that you either didn't know prior to this or that surprised you in the whole scheme of things?
Two things were the significance of the income disparity levels and the data regarding the massive amounts of wealth that the top percentage of income earners possess. But at the same time, the facts about income mobility were also just as striking when I came across them, and seeing that all of these different numbers refer to statistical classes, but not flesh and blood people, and that people move in and out of these classes, and that those who were in the top 400 income earners in the world in 1995 were all removed from that class by the year 2004.
So one of the assumptions in your paper, and I wouldn't say it's implicit, it's explicit because you come out and say it a couple of times, is that wealth is created. But I think that your opponents would disagree with you. I think they view wealth as a zero-sum game. There's only so much land, labor, capital, and if it's distributed unequally, that's because some people are abusing their power or privilege, they're taking advantage. And so, as a result of that, because it's distributed unequally, and there's only so much of it, and there aren't any good reasons why it would be distributed unequally, the only just thing to do is redistribute it, to undo that wrongful act. How would you respond?
I think that argument rests on an assumption of its own, and that would be a lack of faith in property in general and in ultimately freedom itself. I think that the individual's right to property, whatever that property may be, extends first and foremost out of a sovereign, exclusive authority that they have over themselves, and then building on the ideas postulated by philosophers such as John Locke, they have a right thus to their labor, to their time, and then thus, by extension, that which they invested into. And so perhaps at the beginning, land was distributed unfairly and wealth originated out of a place of unfairness and injustice. And indeed, that's exactly what Ludwig von Mises argues, who is a libertarian who would ultimately end up agreeing with me. He simply argues it from the perspective that private property rights are still something necessary regardless of their inception. So I think it's really impossible to take things back all the way to their very beginning to find out exactly how we came about acquiring property rights in the first place, whether that's something just and natural or whether that's something arbitrary and unjust. It's really impossible to decide the issue. But in the status quo, we see that there is an issue of people possessing certain amounts of wealth, acquiring commodities, and having some measure of ownership over that. And that to change that changes the incentives that govern society and ultimately changes the entire system of the rule of law to one that is unjust in the end. So I guess to answer your question in a word, I think, honestly, because of the epistemological impossibility of understanding the foundations of our property as it exists, the idea that property was originally distributed unjustly is irrelevant to the matter at hand.
So, your paper does, kind of move forward to the idea that we're sort of spiraling into patterns that have historically happened in the past, and a revolt or socialism is the end result.
Right.
Is there a way to prevent that? What can we do differently than what history teaches us in that?
I think that it is to absolve the government from a large amount of its economic influence, not only when it comes to redistributive measures, but also from its special interest to corporations, because I think it's been very astutely noted that the government absolutely does have involvement within corporations and at times ends up favoring the rich over the poor, which is just as wrong, if not more so, than favoring the poor over the rich. So to truly prevent this type of scenario from happening, where the government acquires more and more power and the rule of law becomes more and more arbitrary, as I fear that it might, we have to not only prevent economic socialization, but simultaneously to squelch any sort of public outcry about governmental preference of large corporations and the power that the capitalists might possess. We have to remove the government from its control and its influence and involvement in business.
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit and ask another question on that then.
All right.
So, and that is, that's all very well and good, but doesn't it really boil down to a state of mind, a mentality in the country in general? We can't just squelch something without people uprising, and this goes back to my other question about that mass of literature, and that how do you change the tide of that mass movement that is going in the wrong direction based on your premise?
I think
in terms of mentality, in terms of the thinking of the people.
I think ultimately the way to do it is through education, through people writing papers like the one that I've written here, and then maybe more entertaining so that they can reach a broader audience. And obviously there will always be disagreement, and that will be good, having that marketplace of ideas and a conflict of opinion surrounding all the issues. And we'll never have a society that perfectly endorses my ideas. But I think that as long as we're allowed to speak freely, and people choose to exercise that right in defense of property rights and the human freedom that comes about from those property rights, then we can do our utmost, certainly, to squelch the tide of socialization that is spreading across our government.
Probably not.
All right.
All right, I'll keep it quick so we can all ask one more question. I have three, I'll pick one. In light of the rise of automated jobs, we've seen jobs become more automated over time. As a current example, coal miners feel that their jobs are being phased out by the solar industry. In reality, their jobs are being phased out with the rise of machines that could work longer than they could with no pay. How do you reconcile the future state of affairs where more jobs are automated and perhaps a universal basic income will need to be necessary in order to support the population? How do you reconcile your theory of normative justice, economic justice, with the potential future of a universal basic income in light of a scarcity of jobs?
So I think that's a really good question. When it comes to the issue of automation, I think that perhaps, and this is purely speculative, but I would say that the issue of automation actually managing to take away a significant number of jobs in the long run is one that is unlikely. We saw historically, the Industrial Revolution came about and a bunch of people started losing their jobs in all sorts of other different areas of work. The cotton gin went out of style. Eventually, you saw all the people who worked on building typewriters when the computer came about. They lost their jobs. The essence of technology and innovation is to move forward to new ideas, to new ways of acquiring goods. And historically, we've never seen a problem with a long-term loss of jobs. Yes, industries have gone out of business, and individuals have lost their jobs, certainly. But on the whole, as the population continues to expand, the job market continues to expand, and I think that based on a historical faith in the market, I don't think that necessarily automation will take away jobs. Now, I cannot say what exactly will replace the industries that are now being automated, but historically, something else has always come up able to replace it. Now, secondly, what you're going to see with automation is because it's so much cheaper for corporations, the products are going to naturally decrease in their value or in their ultimate cost. So when it comes to consumers who are trying to acquire these goods, they're going to end up having to pay less, which is ultimately beneficial for them as individuals. And then for those who are truly unemployed and put out of their business by automation, well, if that does happen in substantial enough numbers, then there's not going to be people to buy the products produced via automation. And so to have a market at all, the market will somehow have to readjust itself. The producers will have to readjust itself to finding exactly who they are going to sell to, because having an economy that has a very few amount of consumers is not beneficial to a producer. And as a result, I think that we can have enough faith in the market that automation will regulate itself in the days to come.
I'm actually going to pass right now.
Okay. You've made the point in your paper that any effort to reduce requisite coercion necessarily requires arbitrary coercion, which I thought was very well made. In translation, as I understand it, is if we want to do any redistribution, we have to treat people differently under the law.
Right.
One of the economists that you quote frequently in your paper is Hayek, and he's come out and said that any wealthy society will have some level of safety net, some level of redistribution. Charles Murray's come out and argued for basic income. How do you reconcile that?
I'm not entirely certain of the context in which Hayek argued for safety nets. What I am familiar with Hayek is his respect for the rule of law and maintaining the consistency thereof. And Hayek himself does not object to laws in general. He simply objects to large-scale governmental overreach and the arbitrary and unjust rule of law. So when it comes to small societies, on a smaller and smaller level, we can see that the rules that govern them necessarily change. The rules that govern a family are going to be different than the rules that govern a community, and those ones are likely going to be different than the ones that govern your state or nation as a whole. So I think that the safety nets are a very legitimate point, and that potentially safety nets ought to exist. The question is, who ought to be providing those safety nets? And I didn't really deal with this in my thesis, and perhaps I ought to have. But essentially what I'm trying to argue is that it is not the overarching government which should be supplying those safety nets, but instead they should be raised from the ground up. We see communities have oftentimes been able to organize themselves to all defend one another in time of need and trouble. And so then, likewise, if we have a bit of a larger community, perhaps you have a basic safety net that community provides, because it understands the individual needs of the community, and because no one in that community is denied a voice in the formulation of that safety net. The problem begins to become tyrannical when it gets extended to that federal government level. So I think that I would still continue to agree with Hayek that perhaps safety nets are necessary, but only so long as they are the product of that natural spontaneous order of society and not the result of the imposition of a rationalistic mindset from a top-down government.
Well, if you get a chance to read Losing Ground by Murray, he agrees with you. Thanks.
All right.
You have 1 minute remaining.
All right. One more.
Okay. We'll see who can answer this one, because I'm going to throw all this together real quick. Okay, do you envision any next steps for your thesis? Where does it go from here? Have you run your thesis through any grade level or reading level checkers to determine what your target audience is? Because I suspect it's something like about 4 years of college, because your language level. And what can you do to broaden your audience and make it easier and kind of get your message out?
I think that something I'd like to do with the thesis is make it longer, not necessarily adding more content, but explaining the content more and breaking it down more and more in order to explain the fundamentals ultimately better to reach a larger audience. without having any sort of limitation on the length to which I can go with the thesis. And that would allow me to be a little more humorous and entertaining, make some jokes, try to draw the audience in more, as well as explain my points in a lot more clarity. I tried to keep it very brief in here for the sake of the time constraints of this event and the limits on my paper. So what I'd like to do is definitely expand it. I could see it something being like 80 pages long, and then trying to get more people to read that. And I'm not sure how I'd go about doing that. But at least I think it might become more accessible with the additional explanation that could afford me.